This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 310 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. This one's about Fukushima, Japan. Hope tourism, not dark tourism. Being episode 310, it's a round-numbered episode, so I always try and do something a bit different. And what I've done today is pick a topic that is very special and important for me, and that's the subject of today's episode. Before we start, I'd like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, where I'm recording this podcast this morning. So, this episode, although it's named after the Fukushima prefecture for simplicity and so that it's not a really, really long title, it's actually about travels that my friend Catherine and I did across several prefectures in Tohoku. Tohoku being the northern part of Honshu Island, the main island of Japan, so north of Tokyo. And broadly speaking, we were very curious to visit the regions affected by the 2011 earthquake, tsunami and nuclear accident around that area and learn more about how these regions are recovering. But actually, before I get to that part, I've got to go back a few years to perhaps explain where some of my curiosity at least came from. So you might have heard of the phrase dark tourism, and some might say that travelling to these kind of sites where devastating disasters have occurred might be a form of dark tourism. Now, I think ours is something different, more on that in a second, but nonetheless, I realise I have long been interested in these kinds of travels, whether I've wanted to undertake them or not. I have actually kind of a surprisingly long history with dark tourism. I checked back and it's over 15 years ago, I was a regular contributor to a site called Vagabondish, and the lovely editor Mike commissioned me to write a multi-part series on dark tourism, 6 or 7 articles, I think, including articles on disaster tourism, grief tourism, and poverty or slum tourism, and more. So I went down quite some deep, dark rabbit holes. One of the places I wrote about in that series was somewhere I'd actually been, which was Kaze in Japan, which you might remember was the site of an awful earthquake back in 1995. So, of course, 1995 might sound long ago, but to me it seems not so long ago because it was only 6 years after that, early 2000s, I was living near to Kobe in Osaka. And so I actually frequently visited the delightful city of Kobe. It was mostly rebuilt. Had a completely different feel to it to the other cities around in the Kansai area. And they had in Kobe the Great Hanshin-Owaji Earthquake Memorial Museum. And I went there several times, maybe 4 or 5 times, alone or with visitors. And I returned again on a media trip in 2016, by which time it had been substantially kind of expanded. But every time I was absolutely blown away by it. It kind of feels strange to say that a museum about a disaster was so good, but it really was. It was, incredibly built, really interesting things to say. I guess when I returned to Japan recently, to the Tohoku region, I was kind of able to make more progress in myself in understanding why I really appreciated this museum so much. And so basically that's what this episode is about. And I learnt in Fukushima in particular, they talk about this concept that's new to me, but I think explains what I've been trying to say, which is hope tourism. So I think this is what we felt we were participating in, not dark tourism, but hope tourism. And a quick explanation of that, it's a term that seems to have been put forward by the Fukushima Bureau of Reconstruction and Revitalization. And on their website, they have this brief definition. And it says, for hope tourism, rather than thinking of visits to local areas as being those to disaster-affected areas, we think of them as areas continuing on the path to local revitalization. We believe that it is important for people to see these places with their own eyes. And also, of course, by encouraging people, that is encouraging that revitalization. So here is the story of what we did and the impact that it had on us. So on our recent 2-week trip to Japan, Catherine and I had the middle part sorted out completely. We were going to spend 6 days hiking the Basho Trail with Walk Japan, and you can hear all about that fabulous adventure in episode 308. But within our couple of weeks there, we had 3 or 4 days either side of this walk with no firm plans. We just had some ideas. Now, we luckily often have overlapping interests. I guess this is why we make good travelling companions. And in light of knowing that we were going to be near Fukushima, because our walk started in Sendai, we, wandered the map and thought, oh, okay. And we soon realised that we were both interested in visiting the 2 tsunami-related museums that have opened up in the last few years. So northwest of Sendai in Rikuzentakata, there's the Iwate Tsunami Memorial Museum. And then south of Sendai on the coast at Futaba, the Great East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum. It must be said they have long names, but when you see them in kanji, in Japanese writing, of course, they're much shorter. But they say what they are. Also, funnily enough, complete coincidence, in the weeks before our trip, I happened to be reading Laura M.I. Messina's novel, The Phone Box at the Edge of the World, which it's a novel, it's fiction, but it's based in fact, centered on the wind phone or the Kaze no Denwa, which is nearby. And I was telling Catherine about this because I was like, wow, this is a tsunami related book, and it's completely coincidental that I've picked it up. I just like books connected to Japan. But then that prompted Catherine to remember a very impactful episode of the podcast, This American Life, that she'd listened to in the past. And I'll leave a link to that episode in the show notes because it is an episode about the Kaze no Denwa. Anyway, we decided we needed to visit the phone box as well. So we had these 3 tsunami-related sites and just enough time to kind of find our way between them in our spare days. And so that is exactly what we did. So, number 1, the Kaze no Denwa, or the wind phone. Now, this is actually a place I don't want to send thousands or even hundreds of tourists to visit. It's tucked away in a tiny town, not a lot of tourism infrastructure nearby. So I won't say much about it, but I will mention it because it was a super moving experience, and I think really interested tourists probably could find their way there. So what is a wind phone? Well, in this case, it's an old phone booth with a disconnected phone inside, and it's sitting inside the garden of a man's home near the coast in Iwate Prefecture. So it actually predates the tsunami by a year. So this man's cousin died, and he felt moved to set up this phone booth in his garden so he could talk to his cousin on the phone through this wind phone, and he felt connected to him that way after his death. So that was, just one man's idea. But then, within 12 months of setting up his phone there, the tsunami of 2011 happened. And apparently about 10% of the population of that village lost their lives in the tsunami. And so this man then opened up his phone booth to the public because he thought it might help many others to feel they could be able to talk to their lost loved ones. And I think especially in the case of the tsunami, when we say lost, some of them were not found, even the bodies weren't found. And just to imagine not having closure as well, I think that probably helped even more. So over the years, apparently some thousands of people have visited, and the podcast episode I mentioned from This American Life includes some recordings of people visiting there. It's so sad, but somehow also very uplifting. Anyway, so we were going to be nearby, and Catherine and I were both very keen to visit this phone booth. It's an unusual thing to do, but we were there one late afternoon. We're the only ones there. I think I'm glad of that. It's not the kind of mood you want to share with strangers. It's very kind of confusing place of both grief and hope. But I guess actually grief and hope are probably those emotions that stayed with us most through our other tsunami related experiences as well. So our second spot was the Iwate Tsunami Memorial Museum in Rikuzentakata, so in Iwate, northeast of Sendai. So this was the following day, and we took the train and then the bus to Rikuzentakata. Some of this area they haven't restored train lines; they've used buses instead, to the Iwate Tsunami Memorial Museum. So this opened actually in 2019, so kind of unfortunate timing. So with the intervening pandemic having stopped much travel in Japan, it hasn't been so widely publicised, but I would absolutely encourage you to visit. So it's set very close to the sea, as well as this kind of incredibly designed building which houses the museum and a restaurant and so on. There are also several other points of interest in the surrounds, and you can just walk to them from the museum. There's clear maps. You can look over the sea where there was a forest of some 70,000 trees near the edge. All but one of those were destroyed by the tsunami. Now it's home to a new plantation of trees, which will hopefully, be one of the barriers against future tsunamis. But the one tree that survived became known as the miracle pine. It's a very tall and lonely tree. Very sadly, a year after the tsunami, the locals realised it was actually dying because of the inundation of salt water from the tsunami, but it had become such a symbol of hope, I guess, that they found a way to preserve it as a memorial. So this very, very tall lone tree still stands. Behind it, there's a youth hostel that was severely damaged in the earthquake and tsunami, and that stands there unrepaired as a memorial too. So inside the building, the museum itself is incredible. There are several there's short films to watch, and then the displays are in 4 zones, tracing history, learning the facts, learning lessons, and moving towards reconstruction together. And those final sections include like some analysis of some of the failings of how they dealt with the 2011 tsunami and measures they're taking to improve, including education via places like this very museum. It's a real, let's learn and let's make things better. The thing that I came away with thinking about the most is this principle that they reiterated, which I just find so hard to think about. So it's called tendenko. And they describe this as basically an indigenous idiom meaning each person is on their own. So the idea is that they teach and have been teaching for many, many centuries. If a tsunami is coming, save yourself, get to the highest place possible as fast as you can. So they've learnt that, many additional deaths actually occur by people trying to go and find their loved ones first. So this Tendenko philosophy is a saying that's handed down from many, many generations. This coastline has always been subject to tsunamis. So there's, a long history of them over the centuries. But it just feels so hard to imagine having to do this, especially as a parent. I think it only makes sense to want to check on your children first. The logic, though, is irrefutable. If everybody is headed up, out of the way, then, it's probably for the best. But I just don't think I could follow it, though. But reading all about that was quite heart-wrenching. So then our final stop was the Great East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum in Futaba. So this is further down the coast in Fukushima Prefecture between Sendai and Tokyo on the coast. And we went to this museum after we'd finished our hike, so we'd had a complete break from this in between. But this was the most impactful place, I think. The town of Futaba had been part of the evacuation zone. Residents couldn't even re-enter the area for 4 years after the tsunami, so that it opened up a little in 2015. But it took nearly a decade for the train line to be reopened, and a new station was built at Futaba. They have this beautiful state-of-the-art but largely empty and not very well used train station there that opened in 2020. And residents can now return and live in Futaba again, but there's just a tiny number who have returned and rebuilt. We could see as we wandered, but there is also this kind of sense of some resilience and degree of hope. So they have the Futaba Art District, for example. So they've a group who's organised so far about a dozen huge murals, building-sized murals around Futaba, featuring local people and messages of hope and revitalisation. We had a wander around to the town to look at them, and I'll put some photos of those in the show notes. But there's still so much, really clear evidence of the town's devastation from the earthquake tsunami. and the subsequent nuclear disaster nearby. So there's a mix of many empty blocks where obviously damaged homes and buildings have been torn down, and entire streets that still have only damaged and abandoned buildings there. But the hope part is what is now bringing people to Futaba is this new museum, which opened, unfortunately, during the pandemic in May 2020, so a slower start, but it is incredible, like the one in Iwate. It's beautifully designed and curated. We spent hours absorbing it all. And they actually, near the beginning, they list some goals of the museum, which I think summarise it beautifully and kind of play into this hope tourism idea as well. So I am just going to read you what they have in their display. So the 3 goals are these: to share with the world and pass down to future generations information about the nuclear disaster revitalisation efforts and the lessons that were learned. To promote disaster risk reduction and mitigation that reflects the Fukushima specific experiences and lessons that were learned. And lastly, to contribute to the speed up of revitalisation efforts by collaborating with people and organisations that support Fukushima to revive regional communities, culture and tradition, while fostering the next generation who will continue revitalisation efforts. So you start there in this high-ceilinged, round, white room. It's really beautiful, and you watch a film which describes the disaster. We were very well looked after by museum staff there. I think we were the only foreign tourists I saw there that day, but there was a lot of school groups who came through while we were there. And the museum staff brought us iPads with headphones that did English translations there in that initial film and for various videos on display throughout the museum. And most of the other displays, or many of them, had written English translations as well. There was plenty for us to see and read. So as well as exhibits explaining the history and culture of the region and the timeline of the disaster and the reconstruction, there were a lot of personal stories throughout, some written, some on video, and they were really important to give a human face to the numbers. What really struck me there in this museum was they talked a lot about the evacuation situation, and especially because so many residents weren't allowed back to their towns for literally years. Some ended up staying in multiple different evacuation centres over the time, and just can't imagine the trauma of becoming homeless and most likely having lost friends or family members and trying to rebuild a life while you don't have anywhere to stay. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. Unbelievable. But one statistic I read there said that 20% of evacuees had to relocate to new shelters 5 times. So I cannot imagine. There was also a lot of displays explaining the decontamination work that's apparently successfully been happening there, and also lots of displays about the ongoing mental health issues and needs for ongoing counselling and support. So that was encouraging to see as well. We actually met a guide there. His name was Ken, who had previously worked at the Iwate Museum as well. So he was very interesting and so passionate about doing something helpful. So we chatted with him for ages. Such an interesting guy. So he was actually from Yokohama, but he had some connection to the Indian embassy. And in 2011, when the earthquake and tsunami and everything hit, the Indian government actually sent support crews to help in the aftermath, and he up near Iwate somewhere, north of Sendai, I think, anyway. And so Ken volunteered to go with these Indian support crews as a translator, and so he thus became involved with the region, and wanted to continue working in it. So he seemed to epitomise this kind of hope tourism concept, I think. Also at the museum gift shop here, I do love a museum gift shop, and here they had like a massive bunch of Fukushima produced products, and it was just heartening to be able to spend our yen there going back into the region. And it was like the focus of it was these are Fukushima owned and produced products and businesses, and watching the school groups coming through, and they would all stock up, and I mean stock up like as much as they could carry. With their Fukushima-produced snacks, which is the typical kind of omiyage culture in Japan, to take back boxes of beautiful snacks from a region to your family and friends. And so it was just encouraging to see these little ways that the region is being revitalised slowly. So, all in all, we came away knowing a lot more about the 2011 disaster and its effects, but also quite encouraged that they are finding ways to move forward. There are still so many areas that don't really have much infrastructure for tourists. We were often surprised by towns that didn't have hotels at all. We're kind of looking online to try and book things and like, why can't we stay there? That would be convenient. There's no hotels there. But then as we went through on trains or arrived and stayed somewhere, we realised, they really haven't recovered yet. This is why. But there are definitely enough hotels there and trains and buses back, and a really, really hearty welcome from the local people who realise that tourists are an important part of revitalising that region. It's also an easy region to reach from Tokyo, thank you to the speedy trains. It's scenic and fascinating, people are keen to chat, and I really just heartily recommend it. It's not morose, I really don't think. Of course, some of the parts of these museums made me extremely sad, but I think it's important to learn more about these things, and I think encouraging to be able to be part of Hope Tourism. So that's my thoughts on this region. Thank you so much for listening to episode 310 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I've got a bunch of links for you in the show notes, including some photos as well from our experiences up there. The links include Really Long Distance, which is the This American Life episode about the wind phone. Also links to the Iwate Tsunami Memorial Museum and the Great East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum. The links are a bit hard to read out, so please just either Google those or go to the show notes. Also a link to Hope Tourism, that concept. There's some information from Fukushima. And also a link to our Walk Japan hike, which was episode 308. Don't forget as well to come along to the Facebook or LinkedIn groups for Thoughtful Travellers. You can find those links in the show notes or just type in Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook and LinkedIn. And so all of this information will be in the show notes, which for this episode will be at notaballerina.com/310 for episode 310. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.